Hi there, folks. Getting started in just a minute or two. All right, it is 1 o'clock. Let's get started. So I do have a couple questions that were emailed in from American government, and I've got two questions that got emailed in for methodology. If you have other questions, watching right now, if you've got other questions, feel free to email those over. If you don't want to email or to ask right now, I guess you can ask when I'm in physical office hours. In physical office hours in the afternoon on Friday. I've got a final from 12:30 to 2:30, and I'll be in office hours for about 90 minutes after that. All right, so let's get started. Let's do a little bit of methods up top. So I do have some students who had emailed to ask about t-tests. So when I'm asking you to determine whether two groups are actually different or not, I'm asking you to do a t-test. So a t-test is going to be linked very closely with the margin of error calculation we did before, confidence interval calculation. So when we're doing a t-test, the first thing I want you to do is actually create a margin of error for the desired confidence interval around your sample. So if 20% of the public thinks Barack Obama is Muslim, well, then your P is 0.28 and give me a confidence interval around that. If I don't specify what type of confidence I'm looking for, then go with the default of 95% confidence interval. All right, so once you have built a confidence interval around two numbers, let's say you want to compare that 28% number with a different number, say 40%. Step one, the first thing you would do would be to build a confidence interval around each of them. So if you build a confidence interval around two numbers, 95% confidence around two numbers, and those two confidence intervals do not overlap, meaning the bottom end of the higher confidence interval is greater than the top end of the lower confidence interval. So if these two figures are different, the 95% confidence intervals are totally different, and there's space between them, then you can be sure, and not with 95% confidence, that there really is a significant difference between those two figures. However, if there is no overlap in the confidence interval, that doesn't mean that there isn't a statistically significant difference. So think about it this way. If I have my two confidence intervals, so here and here, these are my 95% confidence intervals. So I can say, look, I'm 95% certain that this is in this range and this is in this range. And they're not touching, so I'm 95% sure there's a difference between them. All right, but if they're really close to each other, overlapping a little bit, well, what are the odds that this one is actually all the way up at the top of its range? Simultaneously, this one is at the bottom. What's the conjoint probability that this one is actually as low as this and this one is as high as this? So what's the odds that happen at the same time? Well, if the odds of that are less than about 5%, then we can still be 95% confident that there is a statistically significant difference between the two figures. despite the fact that their confidence intervals at the 95% level overlap. So this is what a t-test does. What a t-test does, we look at two independent samples that have the same sample size, which makes it easier. We can relax that later. And we use that to try and figure out what the odds are that these two are actually overlapping. So how do we do it? Well, we're calculating this a t-value. So we take a look at the difference between the means. So if I'm comparing 40% versus 28%, it's 0.4 minus 0.28, or 12%, 0.12 or 12% difference. And we're going to divide that by the pooled standard deviation. So pooled standard deviation, that can get a little tricky. That's the standard deviation weighted by the number in each of those samples. So if I've got two samples that have different sample sizes, so one sample size has twice as many people as the other one, I would weight it so the number with the larger sample size behind it would have more of a weight in calculating the pooled standard error. So for instance, if I had one sample size that one group had 1,000, one group had 400, to get my pooled standard deviation, what I would do is I would take the first one would have a weight of 1,000 divided by the total of 1,400, plus the second one would have a weight of 400 divided by 1,400, the total sample size between the two of them. So I would take 1,000 out of 1,400, multiply that by multiply the standard deviation of the group that is end of 1,000, add in 400 divided by 1,400 times the sample size of the second group that has a sample size of 400. If the sample size for the two of them are exactly the same, and if we're looking at people who think Barack Obama is a Muslim versus people who think Barack Obama is a Christian, there's no reason they wouldn't be because they're both percentages of the same larger group. Then the pooled standard deviation is just the mean of the standard deviation for each sample. So you just take those two standard deviations, you add them together, divide by 2, and that'll tell you what that is. So your t-test is going to be the difference in the means divided by the standard deviation pooled standard deviation times the square root of 2 over n, right? So that's t equals x bar 1 minus x bar 2 divided by the pooled standard deviation times the square root of 2 over n. So put that in there, and that will give you a t-value. Now, how do we know what's a big enough t-value? Well, we have to use a t-score table. You can look one of these up online, or there is one in your Blackboard pages. In the Blackboard pages, essentially what you need to remember is that with a sufficiently large sample size, bigger than about 120, a t-test table looks just like a z-score table. So if you want to find out something was statistically significant on a z-score table at 95% confidence, you'd be looking for a value of 1.96. In a t-score table, a t-value table, it'd be the same thing. As long as you have a sample size sufficiently large, a value of 1.96 is going to be big enough. As the sample size goes down, the required t-test, critical value for the t-score table to meet statistical significance goes up. So if we're down to 30 or 40, your critical value might be 2.6, 2.7, maybe even as high as 3 or 4. But as long as you're working with sample sizes bigger than about 120, it's going to be equivalent to z-score table. So a value of greater than 2 is pretty much always going to be statistically significant. Okay, we've got someone asking in the chat window, so we'll get that first. Talk about question number 33 from the American government's final. How has the party machine model remained viable in New Jersey even as it declined in other parts of the country? All right, it's pretty easy. So why did the political machine model decline in other parts of the country? First, let's talk about what a political machine is. This goes back to the spoils system. Spoils system inaugurated, of course, by Andrew Jackson. And the idea behind the spoils system is that Andrew Jackson didn't like that all the people who were running the government of Washington were essentially the second sons of rich Virginia planters, because those guys didn't like him, and he didn't like them. And so he saw no reason why those guys should be running the government. He wanted people who were loyal to him, good Democrats, to be running the government. So what did he do? Well, when he got in office, he fired all of them. Now, today that's de rigueur, right? When a new president comes to power, they fire all the people that were put in by the old person. But that hadn't happened before up to that point. The bureaucrats were kind of permanent. They stuck around regardless of who was in charge, which also makes sense given that all the people who had been in charge, all the presidents, had kind of been similar people. They all kind of been rich white planters from Virginia, with the exceptions, of course, of the Adamses, John Quincy and John Adams. So when Jackson does this, he wants to put in loyal Democratic Republicans into the seats, into the government. So how does he know if you're loyal? Well, that pretty quickly devolves into who helped me out during the campaign, who gave me money, who who supported me during the campaign. Those people are going to get the jobs. In addition, if you were a loyal member of the party, if you're a loyal Democratic Republican, or pretty soon a loyal Whig, when you got into office, we would also expect that you would kick back some of your salary. That is, you would pay a proportion of your salary back to the party as a thank you for letting you have this job. So that's pretty clearly corruption, right? So the idea is you get appointed as a postmaster general in your town, and you're going to take your salary, and by the later part of the school system, as much as 40% of your salary, and send that right back to the political party. So the political parties in government are going to raise salaries, for instance, and create all these new posts, and the people in those posts are then going to take those salaries and give it back to the party. So this essentially is a tax on the people, like money coming from the public that's going to line the pockets of the parties through the intermediary of government officials. So what killed this? What killed it was what we call the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act was passed in the wake of the shooting of James Garfield, passed by President Arthur. And what the Pendleton Act did was it required that to get a civil service job, you had to pass a civil service exam. You had to go to qualified people. Basically taking a lot of these decisions about who to hire out of the hands of the president. The other thing that really got to it was the beginning of primary elections and sort of progressive reforms we talked about between the 1890s and the 1920s. Why would that matter? Well, because it was difficult for the parties to enforce their voting rules, to make sure that everyone voted the way they were supposed to vote, that individual citizens voted the way they were supposed to vote, and so they weren't able to keep as tight a control on who was voting for whom. So those reforms, so the Pendleton Act, progressive reforms, really ended this culture of kickbacks. And basically, when you have the progressive reforms, it's hard to be corrupt after the progressive reforms because there's a lot of public scrutiny of what you're doing, and there's journalists who are watching you. So how did the political machine model remain viable in New Jersey? Because we still kind of have political machines here run by called county bosses. People like Joe DiVincenzo in Essex County in the northern part of the state, Norcross in the southern part of the state. So how does that remain viable? Well, because New Jersey has so many municipalities, that is, we've got so many little towns, and all those towns are to some extent independent, they're still able to have a kickback scheme. That is, it's still reasonable for them to expect that if I give you a job paving the streets in my town or picking up trash in my town, that you are going to kick back a certain portion of that money I gave you back to the party that gave you the job. Now, in other areas, they did have political machines, but they went away, partially because we had competitive elections. So if you have competitive elections, it's hard to maintain this for any length of time. But in many parts of New Jersey, of course, we don't have competitive elections. We'll have towns that are going to be run by Democrats for decades. And so the Democrats are able to put this in place, or Republicans are able to put in place where they're in power. So political machine, the fact that we can still, that townships in New Jersey, municipalities in New Jersey are still allowed to use kickback schemes, allows the political machine model to survive. Also, the fact that we don't have especially competitive primary elections, and we in theory have primary elections. In practice, those primary elections are very rarely competitive, and the county bosses retain a lot of control over where you go on the ballot. Not always, of course, some counties is going to be randomly determined, but the county bosses still have a lot of say over who actually gets on the ticket for the Democrats or for the Republicans, meaning they can still reward or punish people for loyalty or perceived lack of loyalty. So the fact that county bosses still have a lot of power despite progressive reforms, the fact that kickbacks are still an option. So on the state levels, right, for New Jersey state, if you are a government contractor, you're not allowed to give money to the parties. But that doesn't apply on the local levels. So if I'm the person who paves the road in Bloomfield, New Jersey, I would probably also be giving money to the Democratic Party of Bloomfield, New Jersey. Wouldn't necessarily be as high as kickbacks we might have seen during the early days, 19th century days of the part of the spoil system, but it still might be a substantial kickback, and that money is going to allow all of the political kickback machine, the political machines to keep on working. All right, Allison's asking, what sort of graph should I use for question number 6 in research methods? All right, that's an easy one. All right, so question number 6 says, use a graph to depict the feeling thermometers for these two groups, those who do and do not know that he is a Christian. What I'd like to see you do here is actually make a histogram of the feeling thermometers. So show me a feeling thermometer. This is why I do. I'm not saying that another graph would be wrong. I would do a feeling thermometer of people who think Obama's a Christian versus a feeling thermometer of people who think Obama's Muslim. There are other ways you could do it, but I think a histogram is probably the best way to do it. To do the histogram, I talked about this a little bit on the office hours last time. You're going to want to, there's several ways to do it. The easiest way probably is to go ahead and do a sort function, it's not called a sort function. Do a function where you're going to go into the data and you're going to tell it to filter. Filtering means you're going to temporarily tell it to ignore some of the data. So I might filter assume I've created a dummy variable for is Obama Muslim. So I might filter for Obama Muslim equals 1 and say if you're not in the category of Obama Muslim equals 1, we're going to filter you out for now. Not delete you, but filter you out for a moment. So after I do that, run that filter, it's going to X out. That is going to kind of ignore a whole bunch of my data, except for the people who said Barack Obama is a Muslim. Then I run a histogram of the feeling thermometer variable. And that'll give me the feeling thermometer for just people who said Barack Obama was Muslim. And I'll also get mean and standard deviation for that. Then I would undo that filter, go back into the data filter, and take that filter off, and then put a new filter in. Don't probably put two filters in at the same time because it'll just put one filter on top of the other. So that would take the Muslim filter off and then put another filter on the dummy variable created for Barack Obama Christian. So I've created that dummy variable and do the same thing. Put the filter on. Once I put the filter on, then run the histogram of the feeling thermometer. And then I've got two different histograms. One for people who think he's Muslim, one think he's a Christian. Then I've also got the mean and standard deviation for each group, which will make it pretty easy for me to do the comparison between them for the rest of the question in number 6. All right, got a question back on the American government. It says for question 35. Question 35 is if large groups tend to lose money for individual and small donors, why do they put so much effort into attracting and retaining them? So remember, this goes back to the idea that in very large interest groups, they have to pay a lot of money in particularized benefits and personal benefits in order to attract members. So if they're paying enough money in particularized benefits to attract members, it seems like they'd be losing money on those members. In fact, most large organizations do lose money on individual donors. Not all of them, but people like the NRA are definitely going to lose some money on individual members. So why do they do it? The big reason they do it is because that gives them political leverage. Remember, in the American system, money doesn't help that much. Money helps, but the only thing politicians can do with money is go and try and attract voters. So they're not going to try and do anything to get money that's going to hurt them with the public. Rather, if they have to make choice between money and voters, they're always going to pick voters. Because all they can do with money is try and get voters back. So getting money in order and pissing off voters is always a bad idea. So when politicians see an interest group that has a lot of members, they're going to want to go ahead and do what the interest group wants. And the NRA is a powerful interest group not because it has lots of money. It actually doesn't spend very much money on elections. Normally, 2016 was an exception. But because it has lots of members, and it can threaten members of Congress that we're going to turn out our members if we rate you badly if you don't vote the way we want to on this issue. So they're going to want to get lots of members, and then NRAs, in fact, can give away membership to lots of people to swell the membership rolls, make it look like they have more members than they might actually have, because that's going to give influence in Washington. Influence Washington is going to attract the big donors, which is what they really want. Another side of this that might be important is that if there's a lot of members of an interest group, that's going to make it easier for the interest group to provide symbolic benefits. One thing we talked about in class is that not every interest group can offer important symbolic benefits. So I have an NPR tote bag, and that's an important symbolic benefit only because a lot of people know what NPR is. I also have a bunch of stuff in the Planetary Society, but nobody knows what the hell the Planetary Society is, so it doesn't help. So by having more members, it makes their symbolic benefits that the interest group gives more valuable. And that's important because symbolic benefits are cheap. I mean, the NPR tote bag is worth more to me because it allows me to feel superior to everyone who doesn't have an NPR tote bag. It's worth more to me than it costs to produce. So the interest group, in this case NPR, can give a tote bag and make money off of that. Not lose as much money on individual members as they would otherwise. So having more members makes their symbolic benefits more worthwhile. Cool. Hope that answers the question. I said, if we've got questions, you can put them over in the chat window. If I'm waiting for questions to go up there, I will go back to some questions that were emailed. Okay, we got a question on method saying, what labels would I use for question number 7? So question number 7 for the methods file says, perhaps those individuals who think Obama's Muslim don't like anyone. Choose 2 other political figures for which feeling thermometer scores are available. And it should say first one, I'm sorry. And determine if individuals think Obama's Muslim, it's significant to review those figures and those who know that Obama is a Christian. So again, this could be, you can pick any other 2 political figures, Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, whoever else you want out of that. Pick any 2. And so basically after you've done the filter command for number 6, so you've done the filter command for number 6, you're looking at just people think Barack Obama is a Muslim. Once you do that, also run the feeling thermometer, the descriptors for the feeling thermometer for 2 other figures, for Romney and Gingrich, or any other 2 figures we've got feeling thermometers for in the data. And that'll give you a mean standard deviation for that. Then when you have the filter up of whether Obama's a Christian or not, then run those same feeling thermometers again and see if there's just a significant difference there. What labels, if you're talking about the labels column, I don't really care which labels you use because you're going to be, they'll show up in the output, but you'll be describing it. So not really a big issue. Okay, for American government, I've got a question number 36. If the spoils system was so beneficial to political parties, how did the Pendleton Act pass? So the spoils system was, in fact, very beneficial to political parties. This is where they got all the money from. So why would they vote? Why would members of Congress vote to get rid of it? Especially given that the parties controlled members of Congress pretty securely during the 19th century. So the big issue was the assassination of James Garfield by Charles Guiteau. So Garfield, we know why Garfield got shot. It wasn't because Guiteau was a disgruntled office seeker, though that was the narrative in the media at the time. Realistically, it was because Charles Guiteau was schizophrenic. He was mentally ill, and just happened to be that James Garfield was the subject of his ire. But the narrative in the media at the time really was that he was a disgruntled office seeker. And it's true, he wanted to be Secretary of State, or at the very least, ambassador to Great Britain. And so the thought was that the political parties kind of knew that the system they had for the spoils system, where thousands of people would go to the White House and ask for a job, they knew that was inefficient. Presidents hated it and had hated it for a long time. So they moved to try and get this sort of civil service reform that we eventually got in the Pendleton Act. But they weren't able to do it because there wasn't any big public outcry about it. However, once Garfield gets shot, and Garfield is this amazing guy, this beloved president, even though he'd only been in office for a couple of weeks and hadn't really done anything yet. He was so well loved that when he gets shot, it's presented as an issue of disgruntled office seeker and the spoils system, getting presidents killed. Then Congress felt a lot of pressure to do something. Now, note that initially under the Pendleton Act, they didn't completely get rid of the spoils system. There's still plenty of jobs where spoils were going to be an issue, but it was limited by the Pendleton Act. Because it was that limited, it really did cut off the spoils system. So I would put it down to the public outcry over the assassination of James Garfield by Charles Guiteau. Okay, back to email questions. Again, if you've got questions, you're in the room right now and you've got questions, you can put them over in the chat window, and I will get to those when I see them. Questions that go in the chat window, of course, get precedence over questions that are emailed because you're watching right now, so you should get precedence on it. Okay, Allison just threw up. For question number 9, are we using the original data table or do I make a new one? Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so question number 9 says, not entirely clear what independent effect perceptions of Obama's religion has now. He's valued the feeling thermometer measures. Okay, so question number 9, no, you're always going to keep on using the exact same data you've got now. What question number 9 is actually do is to run a regression. So run a regression on where your predictors for number 9 are the dummy variable for is Obama Muslim that you've already created and party ID. So you put both of those in there, and you're going to see if is it the fact that people think Barack Obama was a Muslim, does that make them not like him? Or it's just that all the people think he's a Muslim are also Republican, and Republicans don't like him. So by putting those together in the regression, you're able to sort out which is driving the causality here, which which is more closely linked, or rather divide up the causality between these two to see how much of the negative effect of thinking Obama's Muslim is because of that, and how much is because that variable is correlated with party identification. So I'm not asking you to do any, create any new data together at any point during the final project for methods, rather than just asking you to run the regression with those multiple predictors. All right. Okay, so question number 42. What do lobbyists get in return for their contributions to candidates? The big answer here is access. So access is simply means that they get a chance to speak with a representative. Remember that we talk about lobbyists as being information brokers. Their job is to spread information, to collect information from basically the public, because they're representing interest groups, and give that to representatives, or from think tanks. Remember, think tanks are groups that formulate policy recommendations, and from think tanks, and give that to the members of Congress. So in order to give that to members of Congress, they have to get in the face of the members of Congress. They have to meet them. And that's what they get with the campaign contributions. Again, members of Congress are not going to give or piss off the voters in return for money, because it's not a worthwhile investment for them. What they are going to do, however, is if you are a powerful interest group, they're going to pay attention to you, but you have to get in the door first. And the money is what allows them to get in the door. We're first asking for question number 31. Question 31 says, how do campaigns engage in get out the vote activities? And so it's asking, is saying advertisement and charity work a good enough answer? The answer is no. So for 31, get out the vote activities. Get out the vote activities are much more about retail politics. That is much more about going to individual people's houses, knocking on the door, and saying, hey, you're going to vote. And when people are sure if they're going to vote or not, what campaigns are often going to do is offer them rides to polling places, offer them daycare, whatever they need to do to get them to vote. So it is going to be much more about retail politics. Get out the vote efforts are not something you can do just by running TV ads. In recent years, text messages for get out the vote have become more prevalent. That is, you have someone's cell phone number, you text them saying, "Hey, have you voted yet?" If they haven't voted yet, you get them to the polling place. Get out the vote activities are often going to differ depending on the laws of the state. In a lot of states that have early voting, get out the vote activities are going to involve, saying, "Oh, you knock on the door on Saturday, ask if they voted yet." If they say no, you say, "Hey, great, let's go do it right now and get that vote in the bank immediately." In states that have absentee voting, a lot of the get out vote activities are going to involve things like getting people an absentee ballot, making sure they fill it out, and even collecting it to send it off. There's actually a controversy recently in North Carolina where the Republican candidate actually collected the absentee vote by mail ballots from people without them having actually filled it out yet, and then filled out someone else, or just threw it out if they voted for the person, the Democrat in that case. So this can lead to problems, but get out the vote activities are going to differ by state. Early voting can be actually getting someone to the actual polls that day. In vote by mail, it can gain the vote by mail ballot and make sure it's filled out and actually take the post office for them. And as I said, in any state, it's going to involve a lot of retail politics, going to the door, knocking the door, seeing what they need to get them to the polling place. Is it a ride? Is it daycare? What is it? What do we need to do? Okay. All right, we've got a question here. Does this mean, talking about number 6 on the method exam, those who believe he's a Muslim and those who believe he's a Christian, or those who know he's a Christian and all those who think he's not? Okay, so number 6 says, even people who don't believe Obama's Muslim, maybe it doesn't matter. After all, maybe those individuals didn't like Obama to begin with, so false belief might not impact their views. Do individuals think Obama's a Muslim rate Obama differently on the feeling thermometer scale than those who know he's a Christian? All right, so for number 6, the first thing I'm asking you to compare is the mean feeling thermometer of people who know Obama's a Christian, because he is, versus the mean feeling thermometer for people who think Obama is a Muslim. Okay? So I understand where you're getting thrown off. The next sentence is use a graph to pick the feeling thermometers for the two groups, those who do and don't know as a Christian. Stick with group number 1 in your comparison is people who think Obama is a Muslim. Group number 2 is people who think Obama is a Christian. Right? Those are your two groups. And that's where you're going to run your t-test to be confident the difference between two groups is real, not just all sampling error. Okay, questions 22 and 30. Resistance to the PPACA. The PPACA is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, more popularly known as Obamacare. When this was proposed in 2009, It caused an aneurysm among large parts of the Republican Party. The question is why? Because the PPACA was actually based on formulations from the Heritage Plan, the Heritage Foundation, one of the leading conservative think tanks. Put another way, Obamacare is very much a conservative version of healthcare reform. Why it's conservative? It's a largely conservative form of healthcare reform because it preserves the role of the private market. So it creates these exchanges where people can go and give insurance companies their money in return for healthcare. More liberal, even socialist versions of healthcare are things like the government taxes you more and the government provides all your healthcare. This is, of course, what most developed countries around the world do. So why were conservatives so opposed to Obamacare, the PPACA, if the PPACA was essentially a conservative plan? Largely because Obama had proposed it. When Mitt Romney had proposed essentially the same thing in Massachusetts, this was a Republican plan. So this is a question that's really about what we might call negative partisanship. That is, people don't know how they feel about issues, right? Healthcare is a super complicated issue. And so people don't know. If I offer a series of reforms, they don't know if it's good or bad, if they like it or don't like it. They just don't know because it's too complicated. So how do I decide if I like something or not? Well, same thing to anything else in politics. I use a heuristic. I use a simplifying method. And the simplifying method in this case seems to be, if Democrats oppose it and I'm a Republican, I don't like it. I'm against it. And if Republicans oppose it and I'm a Democrat, I'm against it. I don't like it. So this is really, I think, what was driving most of the response to the PPACA. Whereas Democrats say, well, Obama, I don't like Obama. This is Obama's idea. And so therefore I'm going to be opposed to it. So it was less about the actual content of the policy. There was a lot of arguments about freedom, like you should have the freedom to go bankrupt when you get a heart attack. I don't know. There's a lot of arguments about that. And, but it really was more based about negative partisanship, the fact that they didn't like it because it had been proposed by someone they didn't like. And number 22, explain the political rationale for radical reconstruction. Radical reconstruction is the policy of Republicans in the Congress. Oh, sorry about that. You're right. That was number 23. Okay, number 22. So 22, radical reconstruction was the policy of Republicans in Congress after the Civil War. The issue here was that Republicans, prior to the Civil War, the South, the population of the South was limited by the fact that they had the 3/5 clause. That is, that African Americans in the South who were held in slavery, which is basically all in the South, were only counted as 3/5 of a person. So once you have the Civil War and you get rid of the slavery with the 13th Amendment, then suddenly all those African Americans in the South are now counted as full people. Now, it's good and moral, and you probably should count them as full people because they are, in fact, human beings, but that would mean that the South would have far more representation in Congress, and Northern Republicans were worried about holding on to their seats and holding on to their domination of Congress. So what do? Well, if you just left it up to the Southern states, they would never allow the African Americans to vote because it's 2018 right now, and they still, when given the choice, try and stop African Americans from voting. So we know they're not going to allow African Americans to vote easily. And so as a result, we expect the Northern Republicans said, look, we have to pass laws to make sure that African Americans in the South are going to be allowed to vote. So this is what we call radical reconstruction. Policies from the North, from Republicans in the North, designed to ensure that African Americans got to vote. In many cases, that white Southerners were not allowed to vote. So if you'd worked for the Confederacy or been in the Confederate Army, you were disenfranchised, which was, of course, most white men. And since women couldn't vote, that was most of the people who would have voted for Democrats. Now, radical reconstruction is normally framed as being something that Northern Republicans did in order to support African Americans, and it really wasn't about that. Really was very much about making sure that Republicans won elections. So by making sure that African Americans in the South were allowed to vote, were registered to vote, by doing this essentially at the point of a gun, keeping the Union Army in the South to make sure that the African Americans could vote. By doing this, they ensured the survival of the Republican Party. And one thing you might have realized is, well, that helps in the House. What about the Senate? So you have all these Southern states in the Senate, and how are Republicans going to dominate that because they can't dilute that in the Senate? First thing they did, of course, was by trying to get African Americans elected to the Senate from the South, which they were successful at initially. But they also just added a whole bunch of states in the Midwest and the North. So a whole bunch of Western states just got added to the country. So Over a 20-year period, they added about 12 states, including some states that probably weren't ready yet, that didn't have a lot of people, but forget it. There were going to be northern western states. There were going to be free states. And they would help ensure that Republicans continued to dominate Congress. Why did it end? Reconstruction basically ended because the policy was very unpopular. I mean, people in the North didn't like this policy where they were keeping the Union Army that had already won the Civil War in the South for 10 years after the Civil War is over. That seems crazy. And so as a result, Republicans lost the election of 1876. Samuel Tilden beat Rutherford B. Hayes. And so Republicans, desperate to hold on to power, essentially declared the election illegitimate. And there had been bribery involved on both sides. But they declared the election to be illegitimate. Then in return, basically Tilden agreed to give up his claim on the election, on the presidency, in return for the North ending radical Reconstruction, which is what happened. And it was probably a good deal for the Republicans because the policy was unpopular and expensive enough they were probably going to end it anyway, but they pulled out and ended radical Reconstruction as a consequence of that. All right, folks, it's currently 1:35. I have 25 minutes left here. So if you're present right now while this is going live and you've got a question, put it over in the chat window. If otherwise, I will be getting to emailed questions. I do have one more question that I have to get from the chat window. But I said, go ahead and put in the chat window if you've got a question. Otherwise, I will get to email questions. And if I run out of those, then we'll just end the whole thing early, I guess. All right, number 20, explain the importance of McCulloch v. Maryland. I'm sorry, it says number 30. I should get my glasses on. How did the Great Society differ from the New Deal? Which was more successful? All right, so the New Deal really was about insulating Americans from the vagaries of the business cycle. So the business cycle, the idea is that you have boom and bust and boom and bust. In American history, about every 30 years we had, well, today we call it a recession. In those days, they called it a crisis or a panic. And when you had a panic or a crisis, so the idea was that basically businesses are going to take out loans to expand. And as long as they're expanding and they're spending money, then congratulations, there's more jobs and there's more money in the economy. So people buy more stuff, so businesses expand. And then eventually reach the point where it's not sustainable anymore and the business cycle collapses. This is what we call the business cycle. And it was thought in the 19th century, this is essentially a law of nature, that the business moves in boom and bust cycles. The problem with the boom and bust cycles was that, number one, they were getting worse. As the economy became more integrated, as more people were working in cities, as more people were dependent on supply chains throughout the economy. So if this is the 19th century, a lot of Americans are just farmers. They're just making their own crops. And so even if the things go badly, it's not that big a deal because a lot of the market they're selling to is local. And because if you're a farmer, you can always just eat what you grow if things go real bad. So they were kind of insulated to some extent from the vagaries of the business cycle. But as the country became more urban and more people living in cities, then the business cycle, and as farmers were now connected to supply chains throughout the entire country because of railroads, the business cycle became more and more of a problem. So what the New Deal really was about was protecting people from the business cycle. That is, making sure your bank didn't go bankrupt with FDIC insurance, by having Social Security for the elderly, so that the elderly wouldn't have to work. So there's all these reforms. Social Security is actually a little different than other ones, but they're designed to protect people from the vigorous business cycle by giving people jobs when the business cycle is bad, by pouring money into the economy to counteract. So basically, the economy booms. When it busts, the government will step in and spend a lot of money to get you out of that recession or the panic or crisis, whatever you want to call it. It's called Keynesian economics. All right, so that was the goal of the New Deal, was to the government to inject money in society to counteract the business cycle. The goal of the Great Society was to essentially help the poorest and the worst off in America. So, poor people living in cities, people who couldn't afford to send their kids to preschool. So all sorts of groups, people who were sick, people who were disabled. They're the ones who are supposed to be the big beneficiaries of the Great Society. So which was more successful? Well, both of them have a lot of programs that have proven long-lasting. So Security from the New Deal, Medicare and Medicaid from the Great Society, PBS and Sesame Street from the Great Society have proven long-term to be successful. However, I would argue that in the long term, the Great Society was probably less successful than the New Deal. The reason is that a lot of Great Society programs were seen as not benefiting the public as a whole, but rather benefiting individual groups within the public. And so therefore they haven't, let's say perhaps with the exception of Medicare, achieved the sort of widespread appeal that New Deal programs have always had. Like no one is against Social Security. Well, plenty of people who think that Medicaid is the first step on the road to socialism. All right. So when creating the question from methods, when creating the two t-tests for Barack Obama, Christian, Barack Obama, Muslim, are you excluding analysis by analysis or excluding cases listwise, or does it not matter? Okay. So the way I would do that, and I heard you can go back if you weren't listening, if you weren't on the chat before. The way I would do this when I'm doing the t-test, what I would do is I think the easiest way is to go back and create your dummy variable for is Barack Obama Muslim, or in a separate dummy for is Barack Obama Christian. Then go to the data filter, the command under the data option for filtering. And what you're going to do is you're going to create a filter for, I call my variable Obama Muslim, and it was 0, 1, 0. If you don't think Obama's Muslim, 1, you do think he's Muslim. So if Obama Muslim equals 1, that means you think Obama's Muslim. I filter. So if you're not part of the Obama Muslim crowd, then you're filtered out of the data set temporarily, and then I'll run the feeling thermometer. And when I do that, that'll give me a mean and standard deviation. I can run graphs. I can run answer number 6 and 7, then unfilter it, and then do filter again for is Obama Christian, do the whole thing again. And you don't have to worry about this sort of excluding analysis by analysis, all those questions. All right, question number 41, and what is a writ of certiorari? We actually covered this in the chat yesterday rather. So writ of certiorari is an order for a lower court to send up the files relating to a specific case. So this means that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case. So if the Supreme Court issues a writ of certiorari, that means they're hearing the case from the lower courts. Prior to the 1920s, the Supreme Court had a mandatory docket, meaning they had to hear every case that was appealed up to them. After the 1920s, they have a discretionary docket. They asked for, and Congress did give them a discretionary docket, but they only have to hear certain cases. So since they only hear certain cases, we have to ask, well, what makes them hear some cases and not others? Because they hear very few cases. We have the cases that are appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court hears about 1/2 of 1%. I'm sorry, less than 1/2 of 1% of them. So what makes them hear cases more? Two big factors. The first is if there's a disagreement at the circuit court level. So beneath the Supreme Court, circuit courts are the highest level. And circuit courts, when they're making a constitutional interpretation question, are essentially deciding what the Constitution means within their circuit. So if the Third Circuit says one thing about a case, and the 14th Circuit says a different thing about a similar case, that means that potentially the Constitution means two different things in two different parts of the country at that time. And that's not tenable in the long term. So when you have a disagreement at the circuit court level, the Supreme Court is very likely to come in and resolve the dispute. And definitively rule one way or the other about what the Constitution is supposed to mean. The other thing that makes it more likely that the Supreme Court issues a writ of certiorari is when the Solicitor General asks them to. So Solicitor General is essentially the lawyer for the executive branch. People think the Attorney General is because the attorney is right in the name, but the Attorney General is like the chief law enforcement officer. The Solicitor General is the lawyer for the executive branch, not the lawyer for the president. That's Michael Cohen. He's going to jail, but rather the lawyer for the executive branch of government. And Solicitor General asks the Supreme Court to hear a case. That's considered a very strong marker that the Supreme Court, that this is an important enough case that the president wants them to hear it, and the Supreme Court's more likely to. The last thing that's going to matter for writs of certiorari, and the issuance of writs of certiorari, is the number of amicus briefs. So amicus briefs or friend of the court briefs are put in by outside groups that aren't involved in the case but are interested in the outcome of the case. So if you have a lot of high profile amicus curiae briefs, it makes it more likely that the Supreme Court's going to hear the issue. So if it's one thing the Solicitor General wants to hear the issue, but if also 15 different think tanks and a bunch of universities and all that all ask the Supreme Court to hear the issue by putting in amicus briefs, it makes it more like the Supreme Court's going to do it. Okay, that should answer that one. All right, so let me go back over to our email questions real quick. Oh, never mind, we got another question over here. So I'll go back over to the email questions. Sorry, get that. Let's go. All right. Oh, just got a couple ones in there. 43. What does it mean to refer to interest groups as information brokers? That means that when we talk about interest groups and information brokers, what we're saying is that the primary function of interest groups is to feed information to members of Congress. So information could be about the benefit of policies. It could be about what policies the public supports. But either way, they're trying to get information. Remember, members of Congress don't know very much. It's not their job to know very much about specific policy issues. So what they do is they go ahead and ask interest groups, okay, what are we supposed to do about this? Because interest groups have experts and expertise that members of Congress simply don't have. So their job is to replace the expertise that members of Congress don't have. And so when we talk about information brokers, that's what we mean. They're feeding information to those members of Congress. Remember, folks, even though I'm answering someone's question right now, if you have a question, you might want to get in right now. We have 15 minutes left in this live chat. Get in right now. I can't guarantee we will get to it during the live part. We'll have office hours again on Friday, however. Number 44, what ended the era of good feeling? The answer is Andrew Jackson. If you need a more complete answer to that, you can refer to the recorded office hours from yesterday. They'll be right below this in the YouTube stream. Essentially, remember, the era of good feeling is the one-party dominance of the Democratic Republicans, starting about 1812, going until the until Andrew Jackson is elected. And when Andrew Jackson is elected president, essentially the Democratic Republican Party splits into two groups: the Democratic Republicans and the Whigs, based on their approval of, in case of what we call the Jacksonian Democrats, or the disapproval of, in case of the Whigs, the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Okay, 43, 44, and 46. What factors led to the end of the Federalist Party? So Federalist Party did a bunch of stuff that was super unpopular. The big one is the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. Remember, this resulted in a whole bunch of Democratic and Republican leaders being thrown in jail. And that was, I think, rightly seen as an abuse of power by the public. Made the Democrats, the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, look like they were the victims of an unconstitutional power grab on the part of the Federalists. And that really did hurt the Federalists. So that made them relatively unpopular. And then, of course, once they were out of power, Jefferson kind of running the government in 1800. After that point, there wasn't much say, because remember, Democrats or Federalists had said, their big argument was Jefferson's going to turn himself into a king. Jefferson's going to create a French Revolution. And when none of that happens, then their big political argument falls apart. The Federalist political argument was always more negative than positive. That is against the Democratic Republicans rather than being in favor of anything. The other thing that happened, of course, was the Democratic Republicans actually grew to embrace a lot of the Federalist policies. So one would be the National Bank. This had always been Federalist policy to have a national bank, and Democratic Republicans eventually came around and said, okay, I guess we need a national bank. So at that point, the Federalists don't have much of a leg to run on, and they saw the benefits of being part of the Democratic Republican Party, especially as the party got bigger and the government got bigger. You have to put those people to jobs, and so, they got on board rather than get left behind. Okay, all right. So again, if you've got more questions, we've got 13 minutes over there. I will get to one of the methods questions that got emailed in. I want to get to that, and then we'll go back to it. Okay, so I did have question on number 1, so at least someone who had already gotten started. Numbers 1, 2, and 3. So number 1, when we say what percent of Americans know that Barack Obama is a Christian, I do mean that we're talking about Protestant and Catholic. Both of those are Christian. I know there's some people who think Catholics are not Christian. Those people are wrong. They still believe in Jesus Christ. So Catholic and Protestant are both versions of Christian. And then compare that with percentage of people who's Muslim. Create a 95 and 99% confidence interval. So for those 95 and 99% confidence intervals, treat those as dichotomous variables. So remember your formula for standard error in this case is P times 1 minus P. You've got the whole thing. Divided by square root of n. So when you do that, P would be the percentage you think is a Christian, or P would be the percentage you think is a Muslim for your P times 1 minus P. And if you need to find the standard deviation or standard error, all you're going to do is create that dummy variable and then run a descriptives on that. When you do that, you'll get the mean and the standard deviation. Use an appropriate graph. Again, there's lots of different graphs you could use. Try not to use pie charts because they suck, but whatever graph other than that looks good would probably work. I don't know how you do with a scatter plot, but up to you. How do you create the dummy variables? To create the dummy variables, we went over this in class. You're going to need to do a recode into different variables. You can do it with a compute function. I think in the YouTube video about They put up 10 years ago about how to do this. I do it with compute function because recoding different variables didn't exist yet at that point. But recoding different variables is still the easiest way to do it and construct those dummy variables. How do you make sure you did it correctly? Once you create your dummy variable, run it as a crosstab with your original variable. And what should look like is a bunch of zeros. So if I've got all the people who think Obama is all the people that don't know that Obama is a Christian should get a 0 on the is Obama a Christian variable, right? So you'll see a lot of zeros. That's how you know you did it right when you create your dummy variable. All right, so let's go back over here. Okay, I'll do one. I've got 10 minutes left. All right, so let's do one or two more of the American government questions. Then we'll move over back into the methods questions. All right, so 56. We're fair to say Marvin Madison's politically motive decision. Okay, I'm going to make this easy one on you. I did cover the question number 56 in yesterday's live stream, so you can go back and watch that. 39. Suppose New Jersey will increase voter turnout. Again, we covered this in the last one yesterday. And number 40. National parties control state and local parties to the extent that they provide funding. But in general, they don't have a lot. National parties do not have a lot of hierarchical control. That is, they can't tell local and state parties what to do. The local and state parties are kind of on their own. They fulfill separate functions. They do different things. Occasionally, national parties send money and experts down, but for the most part, they won't. Methods question. We're having trouble creating feeling thermometers for number 6. I know it says simple. We're stuck in the pop-up window for linear regression. Oh, goodness gracious. That's going to be a problem because you don't need to do a linear regression for number 6. We're not doing that at all. So for number 6, all you're going to do, create your dummy variables, which you've already done for is Obama a Christian, is Obama Muslim. All right. Then you're going to use the filter function. Filter is the easiest. There are other ways to do it, but I think filter is probably the easiest. And after you do your filter function for Obama Muslim. So when I said variable, I say it's Obama Muslim 0 means that they don't think Obama is a Muslim. Obama Muslim 1 means they do think Obama is Muslim. So I have Obama is Muslim 0, Obama Muslim 1. I say if Obama Muslim equals 1, right? And then I filter out everyone else. Then once you do that, then run your descriptives on the feeling thermometer of Obama and run a graph, right? Maybe create a histogram for that, for the feeling thermometer of Barack Obama when I've got that filter on. And that will tell you what the results are for just people who think that Barack Obama is a Muslim. All right? Then undo that filter, right? Go back into the filter and include all cases. Then after you do that, put another filter in for is Obama Christian. Make sure to undo the first filter for the second one in. Then do you think Obama is a Christian? Put that one on and do the same thing. Put a filter on it, then run the feeling thermometer and run the descriptives. And of course, do number 7 as well, as long as you got the filters on. And that'll give you the answer for number 6. Once you've got the mean and the standard deviation for each group on Obama's feeling thermometer, for just the people who think he's Christian, just the people who think he's a Muslim. Once you've got that, you can create your 99.5% confidence interval without too much trouble. Okay, number 37. Guys, we do have just 7 minutes left, so you've got a question, you should get it in now. Number 37, if third parties can't win American elections, how do the Republicans replace the Whigs? Ooh, that's a good question. Because the Whig Party completely fell apart. The Whig Party fell apart. Why did they fall apart? Mostly because of slavery. Essentially, the Whig Party was divided on the issue of slavery. They hadn't initially been. The Democrats were the party of slavery. The Whig Party was the party of let's not talk about slavery, even though they were mostly the party of the North. But so after in the 1850s, we started a religious movement against slavery, and you started to have public support for slavery in the North, or basically abolitionist support in the North increasing. The Whigs were left behind because they had to take a stance on slavery, and it split the party apart. So the party dissolved into a couple of smaller parties. So Duverger's law tells us that you're not going to have more than one party, more than 2 parties at a time in American system, because we have this first past the post system where the person who gets the most number of votes wins. So it looks like you're not going to be able to get a third party. But the Republican Party was not a third party when they replaced the Whigs. What happened was the Whig Party fell apart. So there was room for a second party to move up. So Republicans weren't a third party when they won. They were a secondary party. They were essentially the second party rather than, or even the first party, rather than being a third party. So one of the major parties dissolved and was replaced by one of these parties. The Whig Party itself became a third party, was then itself subject to strategic defection or Duverger's law, because they're subject to strategic defection. All the people who really would have liked to continue to vote for the Whigs said, well, I could vote for the Whigs, but I know the Whigs don't have a chance, the Republicans have a chance, and I really don't like the Democrats. They vote for the Republicans instead. All right, let's see, number 50. When Woodrow Wilson talked about not knowing which boy to whip, what problem in American politics was he identifying? In that case, he was talking about responsibility versus accountability. So accountability meaning, so in an election, if someone does something I don't like, I should be able to vote against them. Problem is, in the American system, I often can't. So I might not like the way that Mitch McConnell's running the Senate, and I don't like the way he's running the Senate. I think he's doing a terrible job. So who am I supposed to vote against, right? That's what Woodrow Wilson means. I want to whip a boy. I don't want to whip a kid. That's a terrible thing. It's 19th century. He was a professor. That's what they did back then. Regardless, if I want to punish someone for doing a bad job, or I'll punish Mitch McConnell for doing a bad job, it's not clear who I'm supposed to punish because I can't vote for or against Mitch McConnell. If I don't like the way he's running the Senate, I guess I could vote for Democratic senators who will oppose him. But maybe I don't like what they're doing, number one. Number two, I already did. We got 2 Democratic senators. And if I still don't like what Mitch McConnell's doing, what the hell am I supposed to do about it? So that's the problem, is that we have a mismatch in the United States between responsibility and accountability. So the people who are responsible for many of the stuff I might not like in government aren't accountable to me. And Mitch McConnell's senator from Kentucky. He's accountable to the people of Kentucky. Right? He's not accountable to me at all, even though his decisions are going to directly impact me. All right, so it is currently about 3 minutes for the end, so I will do one more question from email, and then after I get that in, I will, once I get that in, we will call this one over. All right, sorry, just got one shot from chat window. Question number 19, explain the heuristic function of partisanship. All right, so heuristic is just a mental shortcut. So meaning that for partisanship, we actually kind of talked about this earlier in the live stream. If I don't know who to vote for, then I can make my life easier by just saying, you know what, I'm a Republican, so I'm going to vote for the person with the R next to their name. Vote for the Republican. In a lot of states, I'm going to make it easier. I don't have to be able to read. I can just look for the elephant, the symbol of the Republican Party, and vote for the elephant. So that's what we're going to get. So this heuristic function of partisanship, it allows me to simplify issues. So I know who to vote for, even if I've never heard of the candidates, because I know to vote for the party. If I don't know how I feel about an issue, I try and figure out, okay, how does my party feel about this issue? We talked before with the PPACA. Say, well, I'm a Republican. The PPACA is a Democratic policy, so therefore I must be against it. And it's not a bad heuristic. I mean, if we take a look at it, there's research on this that shows when people just focus on the heuristic and use the heuristic function, they get it right about 3/4 of the time, meaning they wind up voting for the person they would have voted for anyway if they got all the information. So for most Americans who don't care a lot about politics, don't pay a lot of attention to politics, just voting on the basis of who they think is based on the basis of the party or make decisions on the basis of their party is probably a good idea. They could do a little bit better and be a little more accurate if they paid a lot of attention. But who wants to pay a lot of attention to politics? I can tell you someone who pays a lot of attention to politics, it is pretty gosh darn depressing sometimes. All right, with that, it is just about time to close this up. So, reminder, I will have the office hours on Friday. That is 2 days from now, December 14th. I won't be streaming them here. In fact, I will be literally in my office. So I'm giving a final, this is the American Government final from 12:30 to 2:30. I don't just be able to take till 2:30 because it's not that long a test. So after that test, I'll be coming to my office. I'll be there for about 90 minutes till about 4 o'clock. Just in time for the traffic to get really bad before I try and head home. So if you missed me here and you want to come by during office hours then, it's great. I'll be happy to talk to you then. Otherwise, I will see you on the day of our final. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you soon.